Okay, so here's the third and final review for the final exam on PostClassical. Some of the information in this, if you review it before the last week, we'll be covering in the next week and a half or so, especially dealing with Mongols and parts of Asia. So again, just as a reminder, unit exam, the final December 17th. The way I will grade the final, you'll be doing the multiple choice, which will be 75 questions. You'll have timing, so it'll be 55 minutes to do that. And then you'll have an essay, and you'll have a choice between a CCOT or a comparison essay. You'll have 40 minutes to write the essay. The way that I'll be grading it will not just be based on 100 points. It'll be kind of a sliding scale based on the score you'd receive if it were an actual AP test. So if you get a 5, you'd have 100% on the final. If you get a 4, it'll probably be somewhere around 88% or 90% and so forth. So I haven't figured out the scale yet, but it's going to be scored like an AP test. So let's do a little review of Unit 3. This is the age of accelerating connections between 600 BCE and 1450. At the beginning of this time period, we've just seen a fall of most of the major classical empires. At the beginning, major trade routes are starting to develop, becoming more important. You have a mix of polytheism and monotheism, and women, of course, are still considered inferior. By the end, the Silk Roads and the Indian Ocean trade routes are heavily used, especially the Indian Ocean trade routes. Islam has greatly affected Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. Europe appears to be weak at this time. You see a lot of splintering, you see a lot of issues. Remember, we talked about the catastrophic 14th century where you have the plague, you have the little ice age, you have famine. There's all kinds of issues going on there, not to mention the Hundred Years' War. Europe appears to be weak at this time and it splinters apart. This, however, leads to the Renaissance period, which we'll talk about in the early modern. So historically, it's not all negative, even though the tragedy is a tragedy at the present time. Empires exist in the Americas. They're on kind of a different periodization scale as opposed to the rest of the world. You have the first part of this period being considered the classical age in Mesoamerica. The second part is considered the post-classical, and we'll talk about the breakdown in just a minute. And then women are still considered inferiors. There's examples of a few strong women. We talked about, for example, the one and only empress rather, in China. At this time, Joan of Arc becomes a major influence. So there are a few examples of strong women historically, but they're still considered inferiors. So in the early 600s, Muhammad founds Islam. There's an emphasis on monotheism. The key concepts to review: Allah, the five pillars, Mecca, the Quran, the mosque, Sharia law. And there's a disagreement over the rightful caliph. Most of you have this down. We spent 3 full weeks talking about the spread of Islam, so most of you have this split. You wrote about the schism in terms of how it compares to the Western schism in Christianity, so you understand the Sunni and Shia sects and why the split took place. Just remember Ali as the rightful heir who becomes the fourth caliph. He is really those that believed he should have been the first caliph instead of Abu Bakr. They are part of the Shia sect, and then the Sunni sect are the ones that believe the rightful successor was Abu Bakr, who took the role as first caliph. Islam quickly spreads through the Middle East and through North Africa, even into Spain. Um, in 711, remember the Berbers invade the Iberian Peninsula. You also have one of the last Umayyad caliphs who he's able to escape the attack on the Umayyads at the dinner banquet, and he escapes to Spain. This is where you have the influence of European as well as Middle Eastern art and architecture. It's a thriving period for Judaism, Christianity, and Islam kind of living under one roof in Spain. So you have various caliphates that serve as the religious political authorities. The Umayyad was in Syria. Their capital, remember, was at Damascus. The Abbasid, their capital was in Baghdad. And then the Fatimid in Egypt. The Abbasid Caliphate comes under attack by the Turks, the Seljuk Turks. They eventually push their way into the Byzantine Empire as well. Despite the setbacks from the Muslim world, it was flourishing at this time. It had increased trade along the Silk Roads. And you see advances in mathematics, advances in astronomy, especially in Spain, of course, you see kind of the reemergence and renaissance of Greek and Roman classics and literature, many of which are translated so that they could be read by uh, several commoners. To the west in the Byzantine Empire, it was revived under Justinian. His wife Theodora um, is an important female at this time who yields a lot of power, probably more power than Justinian. This is where you have Justinian's new legal code. You have massive building. You have the Hagia Sophia. Christianity is made the official religion. In the rest of Europe, they're facing the Dark Ages. People are moving to the countryside. They resort to barter trading at this time. We're dealing with the years around the fall of Rome, 476, when, of course, the Constantinople is developed. It is Byzantium, which turns into Constantinople and rises as a major trade port under Justinian. Women in the Byzantine Empire have less freedom than they did during the time of the Romans. But there are similarities to Muslim women too, especially around the confinement to their home, veiling one's faces. However, Muslim women were allowed to inherit property and initiate divorce, which is a bit different than what we see in Eastern Rome. Further west, in Western Europe, various kings and nobles came into power, and power had been shifting since the decline of unified Roman Empire. For example, Charlemagne's Frankish Empire. It was eventually divided into three different areas under the Treaty of Verdun. Charlemagne was crowned the emperor in 800 on Christmas Day. Characteristics of Europe during the Middle Ages, the early Middle Ages, the church was the sole unifying force. You have cooperation and conflict between kings and popes, the decline of learning, disruption of trade. You begin with manorialism, the manor system, and that turns into feudalism. And we especially see feudalism taking hold in 1066 with William the Conqueror. To the north and east Russia, you have these areas forming with a mix of Viking and Slavic people. The Viking trade was huge, especially through the Kievan Rus, which begins its rise around 850, 900 BCE, moving all the way down to Constantinople. Their major trade was fur. And this is when you have the city of Kiev that was formed. Again, remember, the founders of Kiev were thought to be from the Slavic people or Vikings. This is Europe in 600. And you have Frankish kingdoms, you have the Visigoth kingdom, and again, over in this area, you're dealing with the Vikings coming down, forming Kievan Rus here, and then Constantinople here. The spread of the Islamic expansion begins to instigate the Crusades. Pope Urban II, 1095, calls for the Crusades, and they last from 1095, 1096 is actually the first Crusade, up until 1291. If we go back in time in 732, a good name to remember is Charles Martel, or Charles the Hammer, who defeats at the Battle of Tours. So remember that back in 732. But the Crusades begin to push back against Islamic expansion. And although the Byzantines were Orthodox, the Latin West was Catholic. This leads to the Great Schism of 1054. The schism was where the Pope of Rome excommunicates the Patriarch of Constantinople. Patriarch then excommunicates the Pope of Rome, and you have the split of the Eastern Orthodox Church and the Roman Catholic Church. Christians were not as united. The Roman Catholics united, as did the fragmented sects of the Muslims like the Sunni and Shia, but you didn't have this large uniting of Christian faith. Key concepts of the Crusades. Saladin, who is a Muslim leader, go back and review Saladin. We talked a little bit about Saladin in Jerusalem, especially in 1091. Control of Jerusalem goes back and forth. Europeans are exposed to Muslim and Eastern cultures, and Constantinople is sacked by the Christians in 1204. Between 1000 and 1200, Europe was starting to revive. It came out of the Dark Ages into what we kind of call the Middle Ages, the late Middle Ages rather, where you have agricultural productivity, new plows in the three-field system, populations begin to rise, and trade begins to rise, if you think of Venice as a trade port. As a result, independent cities begin to form. Feudalism starts to decline at this time. And this is where we get to the Americas. We talked about the Mesoamerica, the early cultures of the Olmec and the Chavin. In Mesoamerica, it's split apart into two time periods during this range between 600 BCE and 1450. You have the Classic Era, which lasts from 600 to about 900. This is where you see the fall of the Maya or the Mayans. This is their third fall. They stretch all the way back to before the Common Era, to 1 to 200 before the Common Era. They have one fall. They begin to build up their civilization again, and their other fall happens around 900 CE. And Teotihuacan, this is one of the largest cities, larger than most of the cities that we see in Europe. You see a lot of diffusion among many of these civilizations. The one that we looked at is the ball game, the example of the ball game, which we see both in Mesoamerica. We also see in South America with some of the civilizations like the Incas that we talked about. In the post-classical era from 900 to 1500, that's where you have the Toltecs and the Aztecs. Now for the Mayan, remember the calendar, the concept of zero, and their ideographs or hieroglyphics. The Aztecs, just like the Mayans, had a lot of sacrifices and a tribute system. And we talked a little bit about some of the historical theories of why they had sacrifices, why they may have practiced cannibalism, that they didn't have enough meat, they lacked protein in their diet, so they practiced cannibalism. That's one of the strange theories about why we see practicing of cannibalism. Some of the similarities that we see between all of these: polytheistic, they have draining swamps, human sacrifices, and the social class system. You have the beginning of diverse groups of smaller states and chieftains as well at this time. This is especially true in most of the parts of North America, and in South America you have the Incas that rise in the Andean region. Some of the key concepts to remember especially are the Inca Rose and the Mita labor system. For North America, some of the tribes that we didn't really talk about because a lot of it's covered in U.S. history. Some of the key concepts, though, to kind of remember: maize, kivas, limited trading between societies and chiefdoms. In East Asia, for hundreds of years after the Han Dynasty, you have this period of chaos, and things kind of fragment apart. You have a period where several different empires are existing all at once, and they're fighting against each other to try and unify China. The Sui dynasty, which exists from 581 to 618, reunifies China, and they build the Grand Canal at this time. But it's the Tang dynasty from 618 to 907 where you have some of the biggest growth, not only in population, but in terms of religion and bringing back Confucianism. For example, the early part of the Tang dynasty, you begin to see the spread of Buddhism. It's not accepted by Confucian elites, and that's why Confucianism eventually wins out. They continue the civil service exams that are set up during the Han Dynasty. They allow local nobles to have some power. The Silk Roads flourish at this time, but just as we see and will continue to see as we move into the early modern period, a lot of the repression from the elites lead to a lot of revolts, peasant revolts. After the Tang came a number of smaller competitive states. This lasts for some time before the Sung dynasty emerges. Some of the characteristics of the Sung dynasty, which are 960 to 1279. It's smaller in size. They have a strong military. Part of that is because of the use of gunpowder. They expand the civil service exams using Confucian classics. This is when Buddhism is actually kind of stifled. There's evidence that at least one of the emperors during the Song dynasty completely banned the practice of Buddhism. But the civil service exams are based on the Confucian classics. You have advancements in science and inventions, like movable type, the magnetic compass, and the junk ship. One of the pieces of evidence that we have for female subordination is the concept of foot binding that exists well into the 20th century, early 20th century. But it becomes prevalent during the Tang and continued during the Song. This is when women have their feet binded around the age of 5, so that the bones basically heal and create this tiny foot. And I showed you some photos of a few of the shoes and what it looks like, what the foot looks like after it's been bound. You also have the concept of private taxation, where landowners collect taxes and then they give money to the government. And this takes place, it helps build the Song dynasty up. Further east during this time in Korea, Vietnam, and Japan, they're all being heavily influenced by Chinese culture, especially through technology and Buddhism. In Vietnam, it was influenced by India through the Indian Ocean Trade Network. Women begin to hold a higher status in Vietnam than they do in China, and this is partially due to the Indian influence. And during the Heian period, from 794 to 1185, the Fujiwara family controlled Japan and protect the emperor. The emperor at this time don't really hold much power. We'll talk about the social structure. The emperor at this time in Japan is more of a figurehead, and you have most of the structure being held by the warriors, especially the samurai. After their decline, you have a period of feudalism and the period of the samurais. Around 1200, in the steppes of Central Asia, the Mongols rise, and they're originally led by Chinggis Khan or Genghis Khan. Within a few decades, he and all of his descendants conquer most of Eurasia. And the conquering is for the purpose of collecting tribute. They don't really want to diffuse their culture. They don't want to take the culture and have it diffuse as part of the Mongol culture. This is different when we get to China and when we get to Kublai Khan, but the original purpose of the Mongols is really for money, a monetary purpose. The other key concepts for the Mongols to remember, they have very little farming. They're excellent herdsmen, excellent at military riding. They're pastoralists. They're good at iron working, and slavery did exist, especially when they captured certain areas. In 1265, Genghis Khan's grandson Kublai Khan declares himself the founder of the Yuan Empire in China. They replace the Song, and they actually move into northern China first. The Song China exists in both North and South China, and they continue to exist in southern China. That's where you have kind of the purification of the Chinese. Remember, we talked during the Song Dynasty that the northern area was really a mix of both China and Turks. The Turks kind of came in, intermixed, and they created a merging of cultures at that time in northern China. They were conquered first. The one replaced the Song in the north and then eventually conquered southern Song as well. The disunity of the Mongol Empire leads to a lot of different cultural and administrative tactics. In Russia, for example, you have the Golden Horde. This is where the Mongols actually allowed local princes to rule. However, in China, the Mongols were used as bureaucrats. This is during the Yuan dynasty. Islam also begins to play a greater role in the Ilkhan, and we'll talk a little bit about that when we discuss the Mongols for chapter 14. Trade begins to intensify along the Silk Roads, but Russia was cut off from the rest of Europe. This was mostly because of the Mongol influence. Um, One thing that they did that kept Russia back by quite a few years, especially as we move into the Renaissance of Europe, is that they became isolationist. And during the time of the Golden Horde, the local princes were allowed to rule, but they were cut off and isolated from the rest of Europe, so they didn't take part in the trade. They didn't have part in the intellectual diffusion of the Renaissance that we see throughout Western Europe. However, the collection of tribute and selling of tax collecting contracts was a similarity in all areas. Despite the reputation of being barbarians, the Mongols helped protect the trade routes of the Silk Road. Mostly this was due to money. Remember, they were the mediator between Europe and China. To keep both isolated from one another, the Mongols really helped control that middle portion of the Silk Road. And again, this changes with the travels of Marco Polo, starting in 1271. But in China, you have an emphasis on commerce that has replaced previously all of the important civil service exams. There's also the use of passports, large quantities of silk that went westward, and then again the travels. This is starting the age of exploration. We're going to move much more into that during the early modern period, but both with Zheng He and Marco Polo and Ibn Battuta. You have a lot of this exploration of different areas. The Indian Ocean trade also expands after 1200 during the time of the Mongols. It's due to the construction of larger ships. You have rising prosperity in some places and the desire of luxuries by the wealthy. Trade was decentralized and in a spirit of cooperation, it was ruled over by each party's commercial interests. So this also helps make the age of exploration in the early modern period possible. So we'll talk a little bit about that once we move into next semester. Some of the city-states that benefit from this, you have Kilwa, Great Zimbabwe, Malacca, and the key concepts, Islam spread. Remember that based on Islam and its control of the Indian Ocean trade, it uses a lot of the eastern portion of Africa. That's where you have languages, African languages mixing with Islam languages to create the Swahili language. Slavery expands. Women have no role in commerce, but they have one in food preparation. Meanwhile, in the tropics, empires are still rare and people are still living off the land. You have Ghana in West Africa. This is different than the Ghana of today. Remember that they're two different places. Ghana in West Africa is replaced by the Empire of Mali, and they benefit greatly from the gold and salt trade. So one good thing to kind of review not only is the rise of the Songhai Empire, but the rise of the Mali Empire, and that gold became a precious commodity. Slaves as well, even as early as 1000 to 1200 CE, you have the concept of slavery being traded across Africa. Mansa Musa is an excellent example of the gold trade. He takes his travels, and as he's coming back, remember he spends most of the gold, which plunges the area that we're discussing, the Songhai Mali, into a recession because he gives all the gold away. Iron was also important. Merchants bring Islam. Arabic words are added to local vocabularies. You have the concept of the Delhi Sultanate in India, which would be a good thing to review as well. By the 1400s, the Mongol power was beginning to erode. You have Tamerlane or Tamur. He's named that because originally he was thought of as Timur the Lame, and that's how he became Tamerlane, because of his limp. He rises out of a khanate and takes over the lands of Central Asia at this time. In China, you begin to have the rebelling of farmers, and then you have Ivan III or Ivan the Great in Russia, who's able to shake off Mongolian control. We're going to talk a lot more about Ivan the Great in the early modern period, because we'll go back to this time period when we get to, I think, chapter 16 or 17. The Turks begin to take advantage of the Mongol decline, and they take over and sack Constantinople in 1453. And this is the end of the Byzantine Empire. Some critics claim this is the end of Rome. Remember that the original fall of Rome was 476, but that's the fall of Western Rome. A lot of historians look at 1453 as the end of the Roman Empire because it's the fall of Constantinople. And then you have some that claim Rome lasts well into the 20th century and falls in 1917 when you have the last Tsar taken out, because Tsar is a word for Caesar. You have the replacing of Mongols in China, and this is done by the Ming Dynasty, Bigenwai Hongwu in 1368, and we'll talk more about the Ming Dynasty in the early modern period as well. At first, it was the goal of the Ming to rid China of Mongolian influence completely. They wanted to bring back the civil service exams. They wanted to halt all relations with people in the West and create again that concept of the Middle Kingdom and isolationism. But over time, they begin to resemble the Mongolian Yuan dynasty, and they increase their contacts. This is why during the early modern period we see so many religious scholars entering China. For example, the Jesuits who enter into China to try and convert Chinese to Christianity. Again, we'll talk a lot more about them during early modern. You also have the travels of Zheng He, who led sea expeditions decades before Columbus. The Ming are actually the ones who ended these expeditions because they thought it was a waste of time and money, and they thought they could use that money to fight against the barbarians in the north. A technology gap begins to emerge between China and other East Asian nations, mostly because of, instead of growing cash crops that stimulated other industries, they focused on the food staples. Europe, again during the catastrophic 14th century, saw roughly the same number of people as China in 1300, about 80 million. However, because of the Black Death, breaks out in 1348, it wipes out about a third of the continent. The Black Death exists long before this, but this is one of the worst outbreaks of the Black Death that Europe ever saw. It goes all the way back to some of the early Mongol influence, recalling that some historians think the Mongols actually used the Black Death as the first evidence of biological warfare, where they would take disease-ridden bodies and they'd catapult them into villages in order to conquer the village and kill everyone there. So it existed well before this, but this is where you see the first spread, major spread and outbreak in Europe. For those who survived, life begins to improve because as population declines, more opportunity opens up. So in the high Middle Ages, you have more food being available, you have trade increasing, serfdom begins to disappear. This is where you actually have serfs renting land, and you see the first evidence of rentals in Western Europe. You have industrial growth with the mills, you have the guild system, and then banking and lending institutions begin to spring up and become much more popular instead of the barter system that we saw back in the Dark Ages. In the mid-1300s, the Renaissance begins in Italy. It was this rebirth of intellectual thought and creativity. A lot of the rebirth goes all the way back to classical Greece. The key concepts, and we'll talk much more about this in early modern, so don't necessarily worry about most of this. We'll discuss humanism, Da Vinci, Michelangelo, and the Medicis next semester, but it would be good to review Thomas Aquinas and scholasticism. Review vernacular. We talked a little bit about vernacular being the writing done by Chaucer in the Canterbury Tales, and then the Gutenberg printing press is also a good thing to review. So while Italy was starting the Renaissance, the rest of Europe was at the tail end of the Middle Ages. You had popes, kings, nobles, and even merchants were seeking political economic power. The Magna Carta being signed in 1215 by King John. The Great Western Schism. This is where some of you grew confused. The Great Schism is the one back in 1054 that splits up the Eastern Orthodox and the Roman Catholic Church. The Great Western Schism is also known as the Papal Schism. Please remember that this is much different. It happens 1378. It begins, lasts until about 1417. And the Papal Schism is when you have three popes at one point sitting on the throne of the Roman Catholic Church. And this goes all the way back to a disagreement between King Philip of France and the Roman Catholic Church at the beginning of 1300s and 1309. And this is when they create the Roman palace at Avignon that holds 7 different popes between 1309 and 1378. And that's where the Roman Catholic Church is ruled from until it's decided that by Pope Gregory that the power would be moved back to Rome, and this creates the split where you have Avignon electing its own pope and then Rome electing a pope, and you have 2 popes that are fighting amongst one another. That's the Great Western Schism or the Papal Schism. You have nation states beginning to form, so no longer were people fighting for a noble but for country. This is evident in the 100 Years' War between France and England. Joan of Arc, the longbow, the end of gunpowder becomes the invention of gunpowder that spreads through the Silk Road and eventually conquers Europe becomes an important indicating shift in European warfare at this time. And then you have the Reconquista in Spain, which we'll talk a lot more about, but the Reconquista begins to free the Iberian Peninsula of Muslims. So just to end, instead of a map on this review, we're going to end just by looking at a little timeline, kind of for some continuities, shifts, changes. You can see Islam dominates the beginning of this period, of the post-classical period, and you can see where that is in relation to the springing up of the Sui dynasty, the Tang dynasty. Remembering the Mesoamerican classical period of the Mayan culture lasts from 600 to 900. That's this area right here. Then you get into post-classical, which is dominated by the Aztecs. Then you have the European Dark Ages, European Revival, and finally the High Middle Ages or Late Middle Ages, where you have the 100 Years' War, the Black Death, and the end of the Crusades. This moves us after 1450 into the Renaissance that we see in Europe, which begins in Italy a lot further back, but after 1450 is when we see the Renaissance in England especially. And then up here you have the Mali Empire, the Empire of Ghana, and then Indian Ocean intensifying in terms of trade right here. The Mongols exist well beyond this time period. However, the Mongols ruling, especially in China with the Yuan dynasty, this is the time that we're really looking at from 1200 to about 1300, 1310. So that takes care of the post-classical period. And again, some of the information, if you listen to this prior to the last week, we'll be going over in the next week or so. But hopefully you found these beneficial. Make sure that you do look at your notes, you look at the review guides that I've posted online in order to prepare yourself for the final exam, which will be on Thursday, December 17th. Thank you.